Alrighty folks, hello and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, time appropriate salutations to all of you folks. My name is VooDoo Val and I am here for an uber special brand spanking new segment called Pro Tips, and I'm super excited for it. Pretty pumped. We're gonna dive into some pretty epic stuff today, but real quick, I'd like to kind of give you the rundown and let you know what we are going to be doing. So Pro Tips is kind of a more in-depth look at some of the epic features and tools that Adobe offers through their apps. This is a segment where there's gonna be me and some awesome other familiar faces from Adobe Live diving into various apps and giving you kind of a miniature masterclass and exploration of specific tools and their use cases. Is the volume a bit low? Let me go ahead and crank this up. How's that? Can you hear me well? Let me make sure. All right, hopefully that is a little bit better. But yeah, I'm super pumped about this today. We're gonna be diving into the Puppet Warp tool in Photoshop today, and I'm pumped because this is something that I have done some daily creative challenges on before. We've kind of skimmed the surface of this tool, but today, if you've never used Puppet Warp tool before, this is kind of an all-encompassing deep dive into the tool. But if you have used it before and would like to scrub up on your skills, this is definitely the stream for you. After we get through with today's show, you're gonna know this tool like the back of your hand. And quick little bonus special feature for the show today. After this stream is over, if you folks would like to jump in a voice chat with me in the Discord, I'm gonna head over there and hang out with you folks. If you want to dive in, ask me questions. I'll be sharing my screen, doing some demos if you have any questions throughout the show, and it should be pretty fun. So without further ado, let's kind of dive in to what we've got planned. I'm gonna pull all this stuff up. Okay, so for the Puppet Warp tool, there's a lot of things that you can do. You can use it for photo editing. I like to get fancy and use it for graphic design, but the first thing I want to kind of dive into is how to set this up, and the most important step, in my opinion, of using the Puppet Warp tool. So I have a photo here of this nifty gal in this nifty shirt, and we're going to use the Puppet Warp tool on her to kind of move her arms around. If you are like me and you've done photo editing before in the past, I feel like we've all come to a point in our journey where we are kind of compositing or editing a photo, and we wish we could just reach out and grab a hold of part of the subject and just move it, just place it where we want it to go instead of going through a bunch of extra steps. And if you have ever wondered that or wished for that, the Puppet Warp tool is exactly what you need. So to access Puppet Warp, all you're going to do is make sure that you're selected on the layer you'd like to edit. Head over to the Edit tab up at the top and hit Puppet Warp. And this is going to display this mesh over the top of your image. Now, the first thing, and as I mentioned before, the most important step of using the Puppet Warp tool is placing your pins. And don't let the simplicity of this fool you. You are just kind of tapping and putting pins around in here, but placing the pins, the placement of these pins is going to dictate the accuracy and how well you can actually alter your image. And I suggest, pro tip for placing pins, is place pins based on the nature of your subject. So we are editing a human being today, so what I want to do is place these pins on the joints of how this person would naturally move. And another great tip as far as placing pins is you don't want to just place pins based on how you want to move the subject. You also want to place pins based on where you don't want the subject to move. So I know that I'm going to move her arms around, but I also want to pin her in place at the bottom here, so that she doesn't move around as we get into these settings. So I'm going to go ahead and put some anchors there. I'll put one at her shoulder, at this bottom elbow here, and at the wrist. We could even put one on her head if we wanted to, but I'm not going to alter her head at all, so I will leave it. Now, there are some settings as far as, you know, our mode, our density, expanding our mesh, showing mesh and everything. But the first thing that I am going to do, because when you jump into the Puppet Warp tool, one of the first things people do is they place a point and they start moving things around. And what I'd like to do is if you dive in here and you start rotating things around, and it's not really moving fluidly, check on your rotate settings, because the rotate settings allow you to do auto and fixed. And if you hit it with the fixed rotate setting here, it's going to keep everything relatively static, like pretty held in place. But if you do the auto, as you start to move things around, it will sort of kind of pull your mesh around in a dynamic way, and you can kind of see a little bit of movement. I've got a lot of pins here, so maybe let me go ahead and I'm gonna hit escape and come back into Puppet Warp. If I just were to place 2 pins and start moving it around, you can see like the auto is really rotating it around. So check that out. Maybe auto is not right for you and whatever project you are working on, or maybe you need to place more pins, but go ahead and experiment with that as you dive into the tool. The next thing is expanding the spread of your mesh. So I can come over here and I can click the expansion, and if I just bump this out a lot, you can see that that really gives us quite a lot of mesh surrounding our subject. And this is cool if you're, you know, depending on the subject you're working on, but as you can see here, if I expand that mask and start pulling on these pins to alter my Puppet Warp mesh, it kind of pulls a lot because that mesh is expanded pretty far. So I personally like to, at least in the use cases that I am using Puppet Warp tool for, such as editing a human subject or a character, I like to keep that down at like the default 2 or a 1, because then as I start to move, you can see that it's not yanking her, but as I pull it, it does move her just slightly, but it seems almost a little more natural. It's not super extra dramatic as I go in and edit that mesh. So the first thing I am going to do as far as like really editing her is I'm going to go ahead and just start moving her around. Like maybe I want to pose her arm out forward a little bit more, and this does look a little bit wonky, but the great thing about using Puppet Warp is I can place pins as I go along. So if I want her arm to be extended a little more, and in fact I'm going to go ahead and let me real quick, I'm gonna back out of this because I do want to actually hide my original layer and just set up with that fill so that we can really see her and we don't see the original behind her. Let's go ahead and activate Puppet Warp again. We'll place these pins at the joints relative to the nature of my subject yet again. And I will go ahead and start editing this arm. So if I just hover over this pin, I can pull it. It looks a little strange, but I can take this pin here and I can alter it like that, and that looks a little more natural. And you can see because the mesh is not expanded very, very far, it kind of leans her head forward a little bit, which I think makes things look fairly natural. And I think that works for me. So I really love this. I think it looks pretty great. But another thing that you can do real quick is mess with the pin depth. So what is pin depth? It might not seem self-explanatory at first, but we're going to dive into it real quick. So if I wanted to, instead of extending her arm, if I wanted to move that arm behind her head, for example, maybe I want her to have her arm pulled back like so, I can edit the pin depth to make sure that as I start to overlap elements of my mesh here, of the Puppet Warp transformed region, that where I overlap is, I guess, stacked or layered the way that I want it. So if I hover over this pin and I decide I'm going to bring her arm back, You can see it goes back behind her head, and I'm actually going to put her arm there, and I'll add another pin like so, and I will just see about kind of maneuvering this a little bit better because it is slightly wonky, and I want to kind of make it just a little bit. Let's kind of put one on her elbow right here and bring that elbow out. And you can see how you can start to like really noodle with this, and kind of make it a little more natural. I won't be too precious with it here. I urge you all to kind of explore as you see fit, but we'll put that there. Now I'm going to select this pin here, and I am going to actually go ahead and bring that pin depth up. So you can see I've got these little stacking icons here, one pointing upward and one pointing down. And if I hit the up arrow, so set pin forward, you can see that actually goes over her forehead there like so. And as you start to use this, you very well may overlap points of your elements. So that will allow you to push things to back or set things forward, so that you can have a nice overlap and a very dynamic transformation of your piece, which is super helpful in my opinion. This little weird part of this arm is kind of bugging me, and I might pull it down. But again, I'm trying not to be extra precious about it. But I'm gonna actually go ahead and cut some of these pins out, which I could do by holding Alt. If I hold Alt and hover over, it will allow me to cut pins. And I'm gonna bring this arm right back out here because I liked this pose much better than posing it behind her head. This works for me, and I'm gonna go ahead and hit enter to apply, and to me that looks fairly natural, honestly. You might want to go in and clean it up because, for example, with this piece, her elbow is quite dramatic as it was bent before, but that's something you can come in and do either with maybe another puppet warp, with liquefy, with masking, whatever you feel is best for your piece. But it looks pretty darn good to me, and what I'm gonna do is maybe group the subject and fill here and preview the difference between the two. So let's go ahead and hide and unhide just so we can look at it. And honestly, if I saw this in a promo or an ad or something in somebody's project, I honestly would not feel that this was an unnatural warp of some sort. It looks like this is the way the photo was taken, which works for me. Now, there are a few other things that I'd like to get into, and for these examples, I'm actually going to puppet warp shapes and not photos because I'd like to kind of expand the process of thinking, expand your minds a little bit, and open you up to more possibilities with the puppet warp tool. It is something that is typically used for photo editing and the like, but I think that sometimes, depending on which project you're working on, using the puppet warp tool to alter various shapes and graphical elements can also be quite interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and close that and hide my photography group here, and I'm going to open up my little graphic design bit here. So we are going to kind of dive in with these graphical elements to something that is like a little more in depth as far as the various settings and drop downs for Puppet Warp. So I'm going to open my group here. I'm going to make sure I have my blue shape selected, and I will come up to edit. In fact, I'm actually going to make this a smart object, so we'll convert that to smart object. I'm going to come up to edit, go to Puppet Warp, and you can see that this places our mesh around our subject exactly like it did with our photo. But there's a lot of things that you can do as far as the density of your mesh and the various things that you can do with that, and also the mode of your mesh. So if I want to edit the density, you can come up to the drop down here and you will see you have fewer points, normal, and more points. And this is exactly what it sounds like when you first kind of glance at this. So I have it set to normal here, but if I want fewer points, it will decrease the amount of points that I have in my mesh and space them out farther apart. And if I want to do more points, it does the same thing in the opposite direction. It adds many more points with less space in between them. And this, in my opinion, just allows you, depending on the subject that you're using Puppet Warp for, will give you a little more control and a little more smoothness if you decide to add more points. Or if you are working with a subject that is quite simple and you don't need all of that extra movement. For example, working with a graphical element versus working with a detailed photograph, it will just allow you to control very well and dynamically based on what you're working on. So, for example, I'm going to go ahead and place a pin here in the center of our star, and I'll place some pins towards the tips of each star point. And as I come in here to edit these, with more points selected, you can see that I get like a really fluid motion, and this all really starts to move around in an interesting way. I'm wondering to myself what it would look like if we did fixed. I think for such a simple shape, it's not as different as it would be, say, for altering the silhouette shape of a person, but you know, just wanna test that out. Okay, so more points allows us to do a lot of wonky, crazy things. If I want to add another point up here, I can start like really tilting this and really making it crazy, and I get a lot of breaks. As you can see, that point there really does kind of pull out, and I can kind of alter things in a very dynamic way. But if I wanted to, I could also go into fewer points, and you can see if I add, let's go ahead and add another one up here. You can see how it's a much larger area as I start to maneuver there. You can see it's almost like very low poly, and I'm working with a much simpler shape. So if I wanted more dramatic, larger portions, to edit and move at a time, maybe a little less smooth, this would be something that would work for that. So I'm going to go ahead and hold Alt, and I'm going to go ahead and cut these, and we'll place this here. I am going to revert back to normal, and then we're going to go into modes. Okay, so the modes for our mesh here, which, by the way, you can actually toggle on and off. So if you'd like to not show the mesh, just so that you have better visibility on your piece, not super important for something like this because it is a very simple shape, just a star. But if you were working with the photo or something that has a lot of details on it and you're getting a little overwhelmed with having to look through or peer through that mesh, that's also a great thing to do, and you can still edit it and you can still see how our shape is being edited and all that good stuff, or you can toggle it on. It's really up to you. I might toggle it off for now, just because we really want to be looking at what is about to happen to our shape. So for the modes, we have rigid, normal, and distort. So we've been on normal this time around, which has got all of this motion and everything that you can see that we've been doing here. But if I switch it to rigid, this is kind of going to give us a little less stretchiness, if you will, to our mesh here. So if I switch it to rigid, you can see it's a lot more like less elastic, and it still bends dramatically, but this versus, you can see it kind of really bends over there at that point that it's transforming here, and it just kind of gives a lot more rigidity to your piece, and depending on what you're working on, that might be exactly what you need. And I sometimes when I use Puppet Warp, I just love to come in and just make something dance. I mean, why not? But one of my favorite settings for Puppet Warp is actually going into Distort. So what is Distort? Let's check it out. I'm actually going to zoom out here, And Distort allows me to still do all of the things that I was doing before, moving my pins and altering my shape, but it distorts other portions of the piece, as you can see. So while this moves over here, these pins closest to where I'm dragging, you can see they get a little bit smaller, and then those pins that are being pulled away from get a little larger. So it allows me to really create some cool shapes. If you're doing some abstract work and you need some interesting shapes to decorate some kind of promo or graphical piece of yours, that would be cool. I love using Puppet Work for graphic design. While it might be slightly unconventional compared to a lot of the tools we have, I always feel like I discover something very interesting whenever I come in and create with this. And this almost looks like kind of a plant. It's a little broken here because I've just really kind of switched it around. But I think it's cool. I wonder if we could go ahead and use that. I'm gonna hit enter on this, actually. I'm gonna hit enter, and I'm going to free transform this. And this is actually a smart object, so I'm gonna actually come in here and I'll rasterize this layer. And what I'm gonna do actually is I'm gonna make this into, it kind of looks like an aloe plant to me, so I'm just gonna go ahead and have like a interesting little plant. Maybe I'll open my hue and saturation with Control or Command U and make this green, and that'll be our happy little aloe plant in the corner over here, which I think is just kind of fun. I don't know. You can do a lot of stuff with this. Let me check our timing here. I think that is actually all that we have got going on for this pro tip segment. So we've gone through kind of going over all the various settings in the Puppet Warp tool settings bar. So the rotate settings, the expansion, expanding the mesh. We've gone through the mesh density and all of the different modes that you can access through the Puppet Warp. We've gone into pin depth and what that means and how to use it. We've edited graphical elements. We've edited some photos. So hopefully this has been kind of a cool run through of the tool for you. Again, I'm about to jump into Discord. There's a voice chat in Discord set up, which is called, in the Photoshop Discord, which is called Pro Tip with VooDoo Val. I'm gonna dive in there right now. If you had any questions during this segment, I'm gonna be answering them and sharing my screen and doing any demos. If you folks need a refresh or need to see something done again, let me know. But I'm gonna be there for 30 minutes. I hope you will come over and join me because I'd love to chit chat with you guys. But that is all the time I have for now. I've got to take off, but this has been absolutely lovely. Stay tuned because we've got some awesome masterclasses and things coming up for the rest of the day. We have a brand new episode of Office Hours this afternoon, and I'm going to be back later this afternoon with another pro tip episode on some neuro filters in Photoshop. So if you want to come hang out with me for that as well, I would love to see you. But I'm going to take off for now. I hope to see you folks in the Discord. Adios, everyone. See you later on.